Carol Johnson, am 52 years old. I work in the kitchen of the dining room, noisy, hot, but so familiar and almost native. Every day here is like on a stage, where the dishes play the main role, and we, the chefs, dance between the stoves and pots. But in recent months, my thoughts rarely stay in the kitchen. I look back at my watch more and more often, noting how much time has passed since I left Ronald in the hospital. Today was no exception. The manager approached me with a serious expression on his face, but as soon as I noticed his approach, I already knew what was going to be discussed. "Carol, can you work overtime today?" "What is it?" he asked, almost in a whisper, as if he was trying to soften the question, knowing that the answer was predictable. "No," I replied shortly, not hiding my fatigue. He bit his lip and, perhaps for the first time in a long time, seemed to not know what to say next. "Manager, I already told you that I can't, right?" I continued, barely noticing how my voice faltered. My chest tightened painfully at the thought that Ronald was still in the hospital. The manager nodded, as if he suddenly remembered this. "Her husband is still in the hospital, so we should ask someone else to cover for him until he gets back," he said, addressing other colleagues standing nearby. "My apologies, Carol," he added in a lower voice, with genuine regret. "You can come home on time, without any problems." I nodded, feeling something like relief, although an inner voice, as always, reproached me for not being able to stay. "When was the last time you put yourself first?" she reminded herself sarcastically. Our restaurant is a popular Chinese restaurant in the city, known for its value for money. So many people pass through our doors every day that we barely have time to cope with the flow of orders. I didn't mind working overtime before. In a sense, it was even an escape, a solace in a job where every order has its own logic and purpose. But since my husband Ronald got sick, I've been leaving work on time, as scheduled. His cancer diagnosis came out of the blue. We've been married for 30 years, and we've never encountered anything like this before. He was always strong, as if this world couldn't break him. When he was diagnosed with cancer, the disease had already metastasized, and his condition began to deteriorate rapidly. Ronald was only 2 years older than me, and now he was in the hospital, where every day could be his last. His physical strength began to fade, but it was even more painful to see how his determination, his vital energy, was dissolving every day. Ronald has always worked as a freelancer from home, coordinating projects. Thanks to his work, I could focus on my career without worrying about home. But now everything has changed. Since he got sick, I've asked at work to review my schedule. Now I start early in the morning to leave early as soon as the restaurant starts to fill up. My colleagues have always supported me. Even now, when I refused overtime work again, no one complained. I could hear them joking and laughing, as always, lightening the atmosphere. I knew I could rely on them. "Oh, you must be Mrs. Johnson." I heard the nurse's voice as I hurried through the hospital lobby and entered the building. Her face was friendly, but her gaze betrayed sympathy. "The doctor has just arrived and is now talking to your husband," she added, pointing towards the ward. My heart sank painfully. I nodded and almost ran forward, every step echoing in my temples with the noise of tension. The nurse looked after me, but I no longer saw her. In my mind there was only the image of Ronald sitting in the ward, his face haggard and tired of fighting. When I entered the room, the doctor was already finishing the conversation. Ronald was sitting on the bed, his shoulders bent under the weight of his illness, and for a second it seemed to me that he was a completely different person. "Ah, your wife has come," the doctor noticed me first, nodding in my direction. "I finished explaining your husband's condition, Mrs. Johnson," he added, his voice soft but with the heaviness I was so afraid to hear. "Thank you, doctor," I whispered, feeling tears treacherously close to my eyes. Ronald looked at me, his faint smile piercing me with a sharp pain. It was not the smile I had known before, the one that illuminated his face with the light of life, but only a shadow, a faded reflection of the past. Ronald used to look younger than his age. He was always confused with a man in his prime, and many thought he was younger than me. But cancer has dried him up, taken away his youth with merciless speed. He looked older now than ever, and this change in him reminded me every day of the inexorable passage of time. "The disease won't defeat me," he smiled weakly, looking at me. His face was pale, his skin as thin as paper, but he tried to appear cheerful. However, his body spoke for him. Every day he weakened more and more, his strength faded, as the light fades at sunset. I wanted to ask the doctor more questions about Ronald's condition, to learn more about his tests and prognosis, but I didn't have time. "Doctor, let me—" I began, but Ronald's voice interrupted me. "Carol," his voice sounded unexpectedly soft, as if he was remembering something long ago. "How long has it been since we got married?" He turned his head to the window, and for a moment it seemed to me that he had seen not today, but all our 30 years together. 30 years, I answered uncertainly, my heart clenching with anticipation. 30 years, he repeated softly. It seemed like it had been so long, and looking back, it was like an instant. His words cut through me like a farewell. I had to restrain myself from shouting, "No, Ronald, don't say that." "Stop," my voice was strained. I couldn't hide my excitement. "You sound like everything is coming to an end." "Maybe," he shrugged slightly, and his gaze darkened. "Ronald's." Words sounded quiet, but they sounded like thunder. He spoke to that world as if he had accepted the inevitable end. I couldn't stand it. "No," I blurted out. "Don't you dare say that. You don't know what's going to happen. Maybe there are other options. We can go to other hospitals, find other ways of treatment. We're not giving up, Ronald, we can't give up." But he wasn't listening. His gaze was directed into the distance, and his face retained the same sad smile. "Carol," he said softly, holding my hand tightly, "I'm going to leave this world soon, and I know it. I hate it as much as you do. But before that happens, I want to do everything I didn't have time to do. I want to spend every moment with you so that it becomes priceless." He looked at me, his eyes full of love and determination. "I want to go home, Carol. I want to be with you. I don't want to spend my last days in the hospital. Can you spare me a few days? I want to go on a trip that we had planned before." Ronald paused for a moment, as if testing my emotions, before continuing, "Before I was diagnosed. I want to fulfill all your wishes, Carol. So please," his voice became softer, and at that moment I realized that this was not just a dream, not a fantasy, but a reality that he wanted to say goodbye to. His determination was frightening, but I respected his wish. My stomach clenched with pain, and although I tried to hold back tears, the hope that I clung to with the last of my strength was melting before my eyes. Realizing that it was useless to argue, I nodded, squeezed his hand, and went to the doctor to inform him of our decision. The doctor took the news with understanding and professional restraint. He quickly arranged for Ronald's discharge, and the next morning we finally left the hospital walls that had surrounded us for so long. The doctors performed all the necessary tests, making sure that Ronald's condition allows him to leave the hospital. I understood that this was only a temporary respite, but at least he could spend his last days surrounded by those he loved, in his native home. "Ronald, I've come to visit," a voice rang out in the room as we got ready for dinner. "Hey, how are you feeling? Are you ready to go to another world?" Thomas, Ronald's older brother, asked with concealed mockery. He laughed, but there was no warmth in his laugh. Thomas, as usual, tried to turn any serious event into a joke, but I learned a long time ago not to pay attention to him. "Carol, you're here too," Thomas's wife Rita said with barely concealed tightness. Her eyes, as always, radiated coldness, and even the greeting seemed strained. She was not satisfied with my presence, as she was not satisfied with everything related to our family. From the very first day we met, Rita looked at me as an enemy. Her snide remarks and dislike became familiar to me. I thought that since we have a little time before dinner, would stay to spend it with you, Thomas added, as if his presence was necessary at that moment. We rarely saw Ronald's family, but at times like this, their visits became inevitable. Thomas was 3 years older than Ronald. He turned 55, but his life resembled a kind of wandering. He worked at a construction site, but increasingly missed work, and lately it seemed that he was living simply by inertia, without a special purpose. Rita, his second wife, was 20 years younger than him. Her beauty could have been dazzling if not for the cold and harsh expression on her face. Her coarse speech and harsh manner were in stark contrast to the expectations that could be placed on a young woman of her age. However, the real dominant figure was Ronald's mother. The woman was already 74 years old, but she was still full of energy, although her inner greed and bitterness haunted no one in our family. She adored Thomas, praised him despite his inaction, and looked down on Ronald. Her face did not hide her selfish thoughts, and each visit turned into an unpleasant ritual of financial demands. Thomas has a big family, you and Ronald don't have children, and you both work. You should have enough money to help. Couldn't you provide a little support? Her usual questions sounded as soon as she entered the room. These requirements have long been the norm. Thomas was a father of many children. He had 4 children from his first marriage and 2 from Rita. His first wife, unable to stand living with him, ran away, leaving him to fend for himself. When she left, Ronald's father, while still alive, disowned Thomas, condemning his actions. But after his father's death, Thomas returned, and Ronald's mother accepted him as if nothing had happened. Now Thomas had found a family again, but they were barely making ends meet. Their expenses were too great to cover on their own. Living with 6 children required huge amounts of money, and they constantly turned to us for help. Ronald, as usual, remained restrained, trying not to succumb to provocations. It was as if his mother was testing him, demanding more each time. She looked at him not as a son, but as a source of money that she could rely on in difficult times. "Ronald, you should take better care of your mother," she said with a sad look. "She's been so lonely since your father died." Those words cut me like a knife. Earlier, when Ronald's father was alive, their family was really more restrained and harmonious. But after his death, Ronald's mother seemed to be freed from all bounds of decency. She was not shy about asking us for money and did not hide her intentions. Thomas enjoyed it. Ronald has always been stunned by the unrealistic ideas of his relatives, but today, when his own condition was extremely difficult, their pressure and arrogance turned out to be especially unbearable. "We're having money problems again this month," Thomas began, as if addressing a debtor rather than his terminally ill brother. "Could you support us, give us some money?" I couldn't stand it. It was becoming increasingly difficult to contain my indignation at their insolence. "Stop it, please. Ronald is already fighting as hard as he can. Do you even understand what condition he's in?" I looked at them furiously, but Thomas just shrugged, as if my words didn't matter. His wife, Rita, who was standing next to me, laughed a low, unpleasant laugh, as if I was just an irritable child who should not be taken seriously. She waved her hand in my direction, as if chasing away an annoying insect. "I'm sorry, but we really can't afford not to give you the money," I said calmly, trying to keep the last remnants of composure. "Oh, it's troublesome," Thomas sighed with mock disappointment. "I thought you'd figure something out, Carol. You know, I've come all this way for this." It was as if he was looking for a reason to feel sorry for himself. "Ah, what a useless son." His mother muttered under her breath, clearly disappointed that she would not get what she wanted. And that's when I reached the limit. Their behavior has become not just annoying, but literally unbearable. Instead of worrying about Ronald, who was dying, they were focused only on their own selfish goals. "What is the specific situation?" Ronald's mother suddenly asked with a dry, businesslike note in her voice. How is the cancer progressing? And what about the prospects of discharge? Her indifference struck me to the core. She talked about Ronald as if his illness was just a minor obstacle to her own desires. I saw only calculation in her eyes. He has 6 months to live, I replied coldly, trying not to show my pain. He will be discharged tomorrow. He will spend his last days at home. A second later, when I said those words, their eyes lit up, but not from shock, not from pain or compassion, but from joy. I couldn't believe my eyes. Instead of being overwhelmed by the tragedy, they were thrilled to be able to manipulate the situation. This expression of faces filled with selfish satisfaction made me feel very sick. Then we'll pick him up in the car when he's discharged, his mother said excitedly. He won't be able to walk on his own, right? That's not necessary, Ronald said calmly, but his words didn't seem to reach them. Seeing how they talked about their arrival with such joy, as if it were some kind of game, I could no longer contain my indignation. Everything inside me turned upside down, and I couldn't stand their presence anymore. I abruptly stood up. Please go home, I said firmly. I'll do the checkout preparation myself. Your presence is not required. I don't want to see you again. Never. My words provoked an instant storm of objections, but I didn't give them a chance to continue. I just slammed the door in their faces and locked it. My hands were shaking with anger and excitement, but I knew I had done the right thing. I immediately contacted the hospital staff and asked them to ban Ronald's visits except for me. The last days of his life should not be overshadowed by their greed. When I returned to the room, Ronald greeted me with a sad smile. I'm sorry, Carol, he said softly. I'm sorry you have to go through this. I know how they behave, and I should have stood up to them a long time ago. But I just didn't want to burden myself with it. Why do you let them treat you like that? I exclaimed, unable to contain my anger. They make fun of you and use you. Is that fair? Why do such people live peacefully, and you? Are you suffering? My voice was trembling, emotions were boiling inside me. I loved Ronald with all my heart and couldn't accept that his life was fading away. It seemed unfair to me that people like Thomas and his family could continue to live in peace and quiet, while someone as worthy as Ronald should be preparing to leave. You're right, Carol, Ronald looked up at me, his voice quiet but serious. And I'm grateful that you finally told them everything you should have told them. But now I have a request for you. This is my first and last request. His seriousness took me by surprise. I looked at him, not knowing what he was going to ask, but I knew it was something important. What kind of request is that? I asked, trying to keep my voice calm despite the mounting tension. Ronald looked at me with such seriousness that I immediately realized that this was more than just a request. I took a long vacation to be with Ronald until his last moments. My friend supported me, and the medical staff did everything possible to make his last days calm. Despite the pain and knowledge of the imminent loss, we spent these months in peace, surrounded by attention and care. 6 months later, Ronald passed away quietly. His passing was peaceful, as if he had just fallen asleep, leaving me with an emptiness in my heart. At the funeral, I saw his relatives for the first time in a long time. I stood aside, watching them intently, like an animal ready to defend its territory. All this day I expected some unpleasant words or actions from them. But instead of expressing even a hint of regret, their faces were lit up with smug smiles that sent chills through me. What could it mean? For what purpose did they come? These questions have been nagging at me all day. It was only after a while that I realized the true meaning of their ridicule. After the funeral, when I returned home and started sorting through Ronald's things, the doorbell rang. My mother-in-law and Thomas were standing outside the door, hung with numerous bags. We've finally found you, the mother-in-law said, curling her lips into a semblance of a smile. The neighbors said that you returned home. We just couldn't help but come. What are these bags for? I asked, feeling my heart begin to beat faster. Their sudden appearance looked suspicious. My mother-in-law tried to enter, but I stood firmly in the doorway, not giving her the slightest chance. Thomas frowned irritably in response. "Stop standing in the way, step aside," he said, his voice sounding almost threatening. I noticed that they had brought their children, and the whole scene was starting to look more and more confusing. Thomas had his entire extended family behind him, and I realized that they were clearly up to something. "What are you up to?" I asked, feeling my anxiety rising. My mother-in-law laughed her cold, mocking laugh, and then said something so unexpected that it took my breath away. "Starting today, this house is ours. You have to leave." I was stunned by her words. Everything seemed to freeze for a moment, and then my heart began to pound wildly with anger and bewilderment. Were they planning to take over our house? "What are you talking about?" I gasped, not believing in the reality of what was happening. "This house is my son's property," the mother-in-law said with icy calmness. "Which means it belongs to his blood-related family. Here is the will he left us." With these words, she proudly showed me a document, as if it was a confirmation of her correctness. But instead of being scared or confused, I suddenly felt an involuntary smile appear on my lips. I couldn't help laughing, stunned by the absurdity of what was happening. Their plan was so ridiculous that I just couldn't help myself. "What's funny?" Thomas asked with displeasure, seeing my reaction. Rita peeked out from behind him, her face tense and her eyes glittering with anger. "Are you laughing at us?" she hissed in exasperation. Wiping away tears of laughter, I finally met their angry glances and calmly said, "Don't you know that this house already belongs to me?" His mother-in-law froze, and Thomas froze with his mouth open. Their surprised faces were so comical that I almost laughed again. But when I got ready, I went to another room to get the documents and, returning, handed them the necessary papers. "As you can see, I am now officially the owner of this house," I said, pointing to the document. "Ronald gave it to me during his lifetime." The mother-in-law grabbed the documents and began frantically looking through them with Thomas. It was true, the owner's name had been changed to mine. They muttered something in confusion and realized that their plan had not worked. "But we have a will," my mother-in-law exclaimed, pulling out her copy of the document. I looked at the paper she was holding in her hands. It was indeed a document written in Ronald's handwriting, but it was not signed and not certified by any official seal. It was just a letter with no legal force. "It's not a will," I said calmly, feeling irritation building inside. "It's just a piece of paper that doesn't mean anything." The mother-in-law turned pale. She didn't realize that their naive attempt to deceive me turned out to be so far from reality. I took a deep breath, realizing that no matter how much I explained the situation to my relatives, they were unlikely to accept the truth, especially when they were overcome by greed. Their eyes reflected the thirst for profit, and I foresaw that all this would lead to a serious confrontation. Therefore, without wasting time, I decided to act decisively and called a lawyer. "Hello, Mr. Russell, this is Carol. I apologize for the suddenness, but there is an urgent situation. Ronald's family came about the will. Could you come as soon as possible?" I spoke calmly but confidently, feeling the tension building inside me. Thomas noticed my call and stared at me suspiciously, trying to figure out who I was talking to. His gaze was wary, but I didn't give any explanation, just invited them to come inside and sit in the living room. Mom-in-law and Thomas reluctantly agreed, and I told their children that they could play in the bedroom to distract themselves a little. It was only a few minutes before there was a knock on the door. I quickly headed to the entrance and opened the door, greeting the man in a formal suit I was waiting for. "I'm sorry for the delay," he said as he entered the living room, his steps confident and his voice firm. Thomas and the others instantly tensed up when they saw a stranger. Their gazes, full of hostility and suspicion, swept over the man's figure. "This is Mr. Russell, the lawyer who helped us with Ronald's cases," I introduced him, casting a quick glance at my relatives. My mother-in-law's face instantly changed when she recognized him. Apparently, she felt uncomfortable, because she did not expect me to bring a lawyer. Russell, in turn, bowed politely and held out a business card, which they accepted, albeit with obvious reluctance. "Hello," he said, remaining completely calm and collected. "I'm Russell. I came here at Ronald's request to settle the legal issues regarding his will." His presence and professional confidence made a strong impression on everyone. Even Thomas and Rita, who had been full of self-confidence up to that point, now looked wary. And my mother-in-law, as if forgetting about her claims, straightened up, feeling the power of legal authority. "May I see the will you brought?" Russell asked in a calm tone that was impossible not to respond to. My mother-in-law's hand trembled slightly as she handed the document to the lawyer. Apparently, it became clear to her that it would not be so easy to confront an experienced lawyer. She probably hoped that she could trick me around her finger, but now, faced with a professional, her confidence began to melt. Russell took the will and began to read it carefully. We all sat in tense silence, watching his reaction. His every gesture seemed deliberate and measured. When he finished reading, he looked at me and nodded slightly, making it clear that everything was going as I expected. "Thank you," he said, handing the will back to his mother-in-law with a polite smile that seemed to only increase her anxiety. "Yes, it's really Ronald's will." My mother-in-law looked at him in surprise, not understanding why he reacted so calmly. "It means... Is the will really legal?" "What is it?" she asked, her voice trembling with uncertainty. "No," Russell replied softly but confidently. "This is Ronald's will, but it has no legal force. It has not been signed or notarized by any notary. It's just a paper document, nothing more. In order for it to become valid, it should be formalized. Without this, it is no different from a personal note." These words caused a noticeable shock among my relatives. Their faces turned pale, and confusion appeared in their eyes. My mother-in-law was sitting, noticeably pale, and her fingers were convulsively clutching the edge of her dress. She tried to keep the remnants of her composure, but the nervous tension was visible in her every movement. As soon as I mentioned the surveillance cameras at the hospital, her eyes flashed with fear. I slowly pulled the laptop out of my bag, letting the gravity of the moment hang in the air, and discreetly inserted the USB drive into the port. "Ronald confessed that he was forced to write this will," I continued calmly, glancing at Thomas and Rita, whose faces instantly distorted with surprise. "We informed the hospital about his confession, and they provided us with video recordings." The scene in the room was tense to the limit. Rita clutched at Thomas's sleeve, her fingers turned white from the effort, and he, not hiding his nervousness, frowned at the screen, which was not yet turned on, but was already terrifying with his promise to show the truth. Russell watched their reactions carefully, not missing a single movement. His professional clarity and calmness gave weight to every word I said. It seemed that my relatives began to realize that their insidious plan was collapsing, and they no longer had room for maneuver. "This is something new," my mother-in-law finally muttered, her voice trembling. "We didn't do anything like that." She tried to back away, but her words sounded unconvincing even to herself. Thomas, who had been silent all this time, suddenly got up from the sofa, his face contorted with irritation. He rushed to the laptop, as if intending to stop me from playing the video, but Russell quickly got in his way, blocking the way. "I advise you to calm down, Thomas." His voice was quiet, but left no doubt about the seriousness of the situation. "Any of your actions can be used against you." Thomas froze, as if he had hit a wall, and, realizing that further resistance was useless, stepped back, nervously clenching his fists. His face was flushed with anger, but he no longer dared to object. I turned on the video, and footage began to appear on the screen. Ronald was lying in a hospital bed, his face looking exhausted. Rita and my mother-in-law were standing next to him. Their voices were quiet, but in the recording it was clearly heard how they forced him to sign the document. Ronald refused several times, but under pressure and obvious threat from Thomas, who was standing at the door, he finally took the handle with a trembling hand. At that moment, my mother-in-law tried to tear out the will that Russell had returned to her, as if intending to destroy the evidence of her guilt, but her hands trembled again and she let go of the document. "This can't be happening," she whispered, her eyes darting around the room like those of a hunted animal. Ronald would never. But in front of everyone's eyes, in this crystal-clear video, Ronald, with a heavy heart and anguish on his face, signed his will. "That's why this will has no legal effect," Russell continued, leaning forward and peering into the faces of my relatives. "Any will drawn up under duress cannot be recognized as valid." The silence that followed his words seemed deafening. I turned on the video, and the silence in the room was instantly replaced by tense expectation. The events filmed in the hospital room unfolded on the screen. My mother-in-law, hovering over the exhausted Ronald, spoke in a sharp, threatening tone. Her voice, steeped in composure, echoed in the room as she unashamedly pressed him to write a will. "If you die and the inheritance doesn't pass through me, we'll have big problems." Her words sounded like an order that left Ronald no choice. The whole process was clearly visible on the video. Her pressure, the presence of Thomas and Rita, whose cold glances accompanied her every step. They stood side by side, silent witnesses, but their participation in this game was obvious. "Just sign it and everything will be fine," I heard Thomas's voice addressing Ronald, his tone insistent, although he tried to appear calm. "It won't hurt anyone if you just do it." 3 days later, Ronald was discharged from the hospital, but it didn't matter anymore. The video clearly showed how they used my husband's illness to get their way. However, when the truth was revealed to them, my mother-in-law could hardly say anything in her defense. "No. It was just a joke," she stammered, desperately trying to find an excuse. I saw the drama on TV. There was such a moment, I just repeated it." Her ridiculous explanation made me angry. "A joke? Is it a joke to use a dying person for your own selfish purposes?" I couldn't believe they weren't even ashamed of their actions. "If you had confessed right away, it would have been one thing," Russell said coldly, without taking his eyes off his mother-in-law. "But you tried to hide the truth. This clearly demonstrates your intention." Thomas began to twitch his shoulders nervously, his gaze darting around the room like a hunted animal. Rita, on the other hand, stood pale, her hands trembled, but she found the strength to speak. "Wait, Carol, it's Mom," she made him sign it. "We just looked. We didn't put pressure on him." Her voice sounded increasingly desperate. I raised my eyebrows as I watched them try to dodge responsibility. The whole situation was a pitiful sight, and I could no longer contain my emotions. "Weren't you the one who offered to help make the will?" Russell interjected, looking at Thomas and Rita. "Or are you saying that you did not participate in this process?" In response, a new wave of controversy began. Thomas accused Rita of rushing Ronald because time was short, and she, in turn, tried to dissociate herself from her actions. But at that moment, in the heat of their quarrel, she accidentally gave out details that became another proof of their involvement. "We just wanted to do it before Carol arrived," she muttered, not realizing that she had only made the situation worse. It became unbearable for me to listen to their mutual accusations. I turned to the children, who were standing outside the door, watching the scene intently. Their faces were full of anxiety, and I felt a pang of guilt that they had witnessed this disgrace. I quietly called my eldest nephew, a boy of about 10 years old, and asked him to take the younger ones to another room. Without asking any questions, He quickly took his brother and sister by the hands and led them away. As soon as the children left, I turned back to the adults and, gathering my thoughts, spoke calmly. Aren't you ashamed? How can you call yourself parents if you blame each other in front of your children and try to escape responsibility? It's a pathetic sight. My words pierced them like a knife, and Rita seemed to realize for the first time that the children could hear all this. She lowered her head and finally, for the first time, showed signs of remorse. I'm truly sorry, Rita began, her voice trembling with mounting excitement. I admit everything, not just threats. Please forgive us. Her words sounded almost pleading, and Thomas, standing next to his mother, also quickly joined in her confessions. They were like birds trapped in a trap, rushing in search of a life-saving way out, which seemed to never be given. We just want to support our children, the mother-in-law defended. Please help us with the financial part. I do not know how to deal with this. If we are charged with damages. With every word they said, I felt more and more furious. The words of forgiveness sounded so fake, as if they were dictated not by sincere remorse, but by fear for their own well-being. With difficulty restraining my emotions, I said, You still think only about yourself and your money. I don't feel any real remorse. You're trying to justify yourself. Do you hear? It sounds exactly like that. Thomas, caught by my words, involuntarily fell silent. His mother and Rita seemed to feel the same way. Not wanting to give them a chance to continue my apologies, I blurted out even more harsh words. I'm not going to forgive you. If you are really worried about your children, you should find a job and pay off your debts. This is all that happened to Ronald. All this trouble is your fault. Why should I forgive you? It's just not reasonable. The silence in the room was almost palpable. They had no words to object. I looked at them with such disdain that they seemed to realize the absurdity of their situation. If you understand, then please leave this house. It's important to me, and I'm not going to live with you. Carol, please forgive us. They shouted in unison, like choruses of unrelenting accusation, but my answer was as cold as winter. If you say one more word, I'll call the police. At that moment, panic was reflected on their faces. Quickly packing up their children and the rest of their belongings, they left my house, and Russell and I watched their departure with indifferent looks. As soon as the door slammed shut, I locked it, as if this whole shameful chapter of our lives had slammed shut behind it. With a sigh of relief, I turned to Russell. Please start the process of claiming damages. This is necessary. He nodded, wasting no time, having already prepared all the documents. I felt like justice was finally starting to restore justice. The claims process went smoothly, and the three were charged $30,000 in compensation for their tricks that forced Ronald to sign the will. I was determined. I wasn't going to make concessions. Their financial situation was not my problem. I insisted on paying in full. Their lives had changed dramatically, and I didn't feel a drop of regret. My mother-in-law found herself alone with 6 children, immersed in the worries she had brought upon herself. Thomas and Rita, broke and forced to work hard, sold their house and moved into a small apartment. Now they were just a tiny cell trying to make ends meet. Every day they reminded themselves of their transgression, of how the pursuit of easy money had ruined their lives. I stayed in the same house where I used to be so happy with Ronald. Every day I continued to work, and my friends from work visited me, bringing fresh news from the world that continued to move forward. I almost never felt lonely. In the evening, when there was silence, I stood in front of Ronald's portrait. It was our ritual. I talked to him about everyday events, shared my thoughts, laughter, sorrows, and joys. This is the last promise I made to you, I whispered, as if he could hear me. Even if I get sick and they take me to the hospital, I will continue to talk to you every day. I remembered his last words when he was dying, and how he told me that he loved my voice, and that our conversations were the most important to him. "I will talk to you every day so that your voice can reach me, even in heaven," I vowed, ignoring the tears that welled up in my eyes again. The promise he made was sacred, and I was determined to keep it until the very end of my life.